Hi folks, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. Today I'm not looking at a paper. Today's video is more of an opinion or a rant. It started a few days ago when I saw this article on Hacker News, and I have some opinions about it. TLDR, I disagree with it, but I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to critique the author of this article. I'm really trying to look at the ideas and arguments in this article because I feel it is emblematic of a lot of the anti-LLM sentiment today, especially within the programmer community. So let's dive in. So right at the top of the article, the author concedes that he is making a much stronger version of the common argument against LLMs. The common argument against using LLMs for programming these days is that they're not really as good at generating code as everyone says they are. That it's all hype. All the people who are claiming vast productivity increases or saying that, hey, look at how I quickly made an app with an LLM. They're all blowing smoke. And you can have a debate about what the frontier of current LLMs is, where they are good at generating correct code and where they fail to generate correct code, and you might as well have written it yourself. That is a valid debate to have, and there's plenty of areas where LLMs are not going to help you. For example, if you're trying to code up an entirely new algorithm. But then there are plenty of other areas where LLMs will be a massive boost to your productivity. But the author here is saying something much stronger. He's saying, even if LLMs were good, I still wouldn't use them. So he's making much more of an almost personal aesthetic stand against LLMs, and that's interesting. All right, so this is the meat of the argument, treating programming as an art. Author says programmers have an infinite canvas on which they can express their creativity, and hence programming is a form of self-expression. So I think this is the crux of a lot of the anti-LLM sentiment in the programmer community. And I think they're conflating two separate things. One is using programming as a means of self-expression, like the author is saying over here. And the other one is using programming as a means to an end, as a means to accomplish a task, as a means to run a business, as a means to make profit, and so on. And these are two very different endeavors. One is programming as an artisan or as an artist in a very personal capacity. Another one is programming as an industrial commercial activity. And if you're talking about how LLMs can or can't help you, I think you have to treat those two types of programming separately. This argument reminded me of this very old blog post by Venkatesh more than a decade ago, titled "You Are Not an Artisan." And I recommend the whole piece. It is a very deep, interesting, long read. But I'll cite some interesting parts from it relevant to the current argument. This piece is about how modern workers often think of themselves as artisans, even when they're working in an industrial or commercial context. And the key point in this article is about how they approach variety in their work. I'll quote from the post. Artisans often end up, quote, confusing economically essential variety, such as handling all the potential variety and evolution in an online payment system, with economically optional variety, such as uniqueness in handcrafted coffee mugs. If the uniqueness in the product mainly makes the producer feel more special and unique, without leading to profitable differentiation, it's the optional kind, like latte art. The former, i.e., economically essential variety, is the kind that must be handled to make a market profitable? I'll leave links to all these articles in the description below. So that goes back to one of the core points the author is making over here, which is approaching programming as an art rather than a commercial activity. By the way, there is a lot of what I like to call techno-primitivist thought going on over here. If you go back throughout the history of programming, there has always been this somewhat primitivist or nostalgic school of thought that pulls away from the latest developments and tries to pull back to the older, more established way of doing things. The last big wave of this was in the 90s and early 2000s when IDEs were getting popular and replacing plain text editors. And I keep going back to this really interesting article from back then. This is titled, "Does Visual Studio Rot the Mind?" It's by Charles Hetzold from 2005. And this is a long screed against IDEs. As the author puts it, is Visual Studio sapping our programming intelligence rather than augmenting it? This talk analyzes the appalling programming practices it perpetuates, rhapsodizes about the joys, frustrations, and satisfactions of unassisted coding. The main argument of this piece is how IntelliSense, or autocomplete, tries to force programmers to think a certain way, which is true in some sense because it is nudging you along a path as opposed to every keystroke, every word being typed manually by the programmer. The other main thread in this piece is how the programmer feels disaffected and disconnected when so many abstractions are piled up. Here, the author is yearning for a time when there are no APIs, no classes, no properties, no forms, no event handlers, no Visual Studio. And this last line is fitting. It's just me and the code. And for a while, I feel like a real programmer again. So that is what I call techno-primitivist thought distilled. And you'll see how the underlying feeling of an article like this from back in 2005, that is ranting against IDEs, very closely matches the anti-LLM sentiment that we see today from many programmers. So that previous point was more about agency of the artist, how they perform their work. This next point is about the mechanics of how that work happens. The author says, quote, "Using an LLM to write code is like asking an artist to paint for you." So I thought this was a really interesting point because if you look at the history of art, there's actually some interesting parallels here. All right, so this is a detail from a wall drawing by the American artist Sol LeWitt. This is the artist lived from 1828 to 2007, one of the mainstays of an art movement called conceptual art. So this is what this wall drawing looks like. And the thing is, he did not actually draw it. The way this piece came to be was that the artist, the credited artist, Sol LeWitt in this case, wrote out a high-level specification for the drawing. Like it says over here, lines not short, not straight, crossing and touching, drawn at random using 4 colors, uniformly dispersed with maximum density, covering the entire surface of the wall. And then the way it was executed was by various other people who tried their best to follow this instruction to come up with this final drawing. None of them are actually credited. The piece is credited to Sol LeWitt. And here you see all the people that executed the piece, that followed the instructions of the artist. So that's another interesting point that shows that the notion of authorship in terms of who is actually driving the creation of a piece is not so straightforward. If I am giving an LLM instructions and then the LLM writes code for me, is the author of the final program the LLM or is it me? Am I the programmer using the LLM as a tool, or is the LLM the programmer? So I would argue that even if you're approaching programming from an artist point of view rather than a commercial industrial point of view, it behooves you to use all the tools available to you to make your artistic vision come true and to push your artistic vision as far as you can. And the author here is lamenting how we are automating away programming and delegating it to a black box. But that is the entire history of programming, going from binary code to assembler to compilers to high-level languages to garbage collection and even higher level languages like Python and so on. The entire march of progress in programming languages is towards higher and higher level abstractions and making everything beneath it a black box essentially. And you could argue that raising that level of abstraction enables much larger and much more complex achievements. You wouldn't write something like a web browser in assembly. You wouldn't write something like a modern machine learning or LLM system in C++. You need something much higher level, much more agile than that. Anyway, my personal experience with LLMs, especially for programming, has been super positive. So I couldn't really relate to this piece a lot. And I've used it both for work programming as well as my own personal projects. So it's been a huge help to me in both of those. And I know enough to judge whether the output of the LLM is good or not and know when to accept it and when to reject it. But on the whole, it's definitely saved me a lot of time. And it's enabled me to do a lot of small little projects that previously would not have fit in a weekend, but now do fit in a weekend. So now I can do a lot more of those. So that's been awesome. So like Don Draper said in Mad Men, always look forward. So I hope that gives you something to think about. If you're pessimistic about LLMs, I'd love to hear why, what your experience has been like. I hope you give them another try. If you've had a good experience with them, if you're using it to speed up your programming or do new things or learn programming, welcome to the club, welcome to the party. It's kind of the Wild West right now. Everyone is figuring out what is possible and how best to use these things. So it's a really interesting time. I hope you enjoyed that. If you like content like this, please consider subscribing, like the video, and I will see you all next time. Thank you very much.